Moving on to discussing culture regarding AIDS in East Africa. One thing that sets medical geography apart from other disciplines that look at disease is that it looks at place specific variables, particularly when it comes to culture and environment. So, what is going on in that particular culture, that particular environment that may not be occurring elsewhere? So, I want to talk about three interesting things that came out of our study. And in all three of these categories, gender, employment, and religion, what we found is not what would typically be expected. So, if we look at gender first, if I ask the question, would you expect more females or males to have higher AIDS rates? What would you say? Many people would initially say male. Now, sometimes it's split when I pose this question to the class, but typically the majority of students say male. And their reasons are because they're more likely to be promiscuous than women. And what our study showed that actually women had higher rates. Now, the interesting thing is we don't know why. Now, keep in mind that our study sample were clients or patients that went to Tasso centers. Okay, they went to Tasso clinics. Now, when we talked about gender earlier, what did we say about the likelihood of men versus women to going to the doctor? So, women in general are more likely to seek treatment. So, in a way, there may have already been a built in bias to the data. If we tested every single person in Uganda, we don't know what the results would show. It could very well be the case that women still would have higher rates just because of their biology and the way the transmission works, that they're more likely to get the disease. However, we don't know for sure. So it could just be because we were looking at files from a Tasso center and women were more likely to go to the Tasso center. So this is why sometimes you have to be careful when you're looking at statistics and results from studies, because they have to tell you how did they collect that data and was there a built-in bias in the study sample. Next, we looked at employment. We looked at all different types of jobs. But if I were to break it down into employed or unemployed, which group do you think would have the higher AIDS rates? Unemployed or employed? Again, the majority of people say unemployed. And if I ask why, they'll typically say, well, they're unemployed. They have more time on their hands. They have more free time. Now let's think about this. Just say that there is a particular day where you have a lot of free time. You have a day off. Do you sit there and you think, I have a lot of free time today. What could I do? Let's see. I could watch TV. I could do some reading. I could work on the car. I could have sex with a bunch of people. Okay. So you get my point here that usually isn't what actually happens. So in this case, it was actually employed that had the higher rates. And more specifically, it was employed truck drivers and fishermen that had the higher rates. So that makes a little more sense. Again, if we did some mapping, if we did mapping of AIDS rates and overlaid that with highway networks and truck stops, we would see higher rates in those areas. And of course, that is because many prostitutes will tend to hang out at the truck stops, etc. Then we looked at religion. Again, all different religions, a variety of different types of religions. But if we just looked at, would you think there would be higher rates among religions that practiced polygamy or religions that did not practice polygamy? And again, you probably know what the answer is now because it's usually counterintuitive. Most would say instinctively polygamy. Those that practice polygamy would have higher rates. Reason being, more wives, more partners, more AIDS. But it was actually the opposite, where there were higher rates among those that were not polygamous. Because in interviews, we would learn that in many cases, Uh, just because they were monogamous didn't necessarily mean they had one partner. They may have had one wife, but they actually had more partners over an extended period of time than those that were polygamous. So those that were polygamous may say something to the effect of, well, I have four wives, but we don't stray outside of that circle. So over the course of 5 years, 10 years, 15 years, they may have four partners. So that was an interesting find as well. So just keep those in mind because they're all, again, not necessarily instinctively intuitive. You would think the opposite in many cases, which is why it's important to know what's going on locally in that particular culture. Now, after we did research in East Africa, we wanted to find out what was going on in a part of the world where the rates were low but increasing. So we looked at East Asia. And after spending several months in different parts of Asia, in Japan and Taiwan and South Korea, we decided to focus on Japan because we got the best rates here. Now, the rates in Japan are low. Okay, they are increasing, but they were initially low. So why? Well, one could be the isolation of the nation. Okay, it's an island nation, and it may not have diffused there yet. So we could just look at diffusion patterns and say, well, maybe it just didn't diffuse to that particular country yet. It's just a matter of time. So it could be the actual spatial location. It could be diffusion patterns. It could be the actual makeup of the demographics of the population. We're looking at a population that is ethnically homogeneous. So I don't know what the exact percentage is, but over 95% of those living in Japan are Japanese. And then lastly, I have definition of sex. And you might say, well, what in the world does that have to do with it? Well, prostitution is illegal in Japan, as it is in many places, but prostitution is illegal. So what is prostitution? Well, most will say prostitution is an exchange of sex for money. So, sex for money, prostitution. Well, if you're going to say sex for money is prostitution, then you have to define sex, right? So, what is sex? And no one ever wants to answer that question, right? Because it's subjective. I mean, if I polled 50 people, I'd probably get 50 different answers if I said, when does sex begin? But you have to define it if you're going to make it illegal. And different countries and different jurisdictions have different definitions for that, ranging from pages and pages and pages of things to a very simple definition. And their definition is vaginal intercourse. That is sex. Everything else, not sex. What does that mean in terms of AIDS? That means everything else is legal, technically. And if it's legal, that means it is regulated and the women are checked. So some say low rates are because of that, or it's part of it, because those that are working in the sex industry are periodically checked for sexually transmitted diseases. So if it happens to go beyond that definition of sex, which no one would know, or it not goes beyond, but ventures into the definition of sex, no one would know that unless there was a raid. But even so, the woman would still, in theory, be STD free. So that's part of the explanation. These are all theories as to why Japan has lower rates. Now, what we have seen in the last decade, actually the last 2 decades, I'll add 2 decades to that, are increasing rates. Okay, so keep in mind that in Uganda, we saw high rates and falling. In Japan, low rates and increasing. Okay, so those are the patterns that I want you to know. Now, not increasing to the point that they're off the charts, still, comparing East Asia to other parts of the world, they're still very low rates, but they're definitely increasing. And there are 2 main reasons that people say are the reason for that. One is the introduction of oral contraceptives. Oral contraceptives were banned until the late 90s in Japan, which is fairly late for a developed country. So prior to oral contraceptives, condom use was very high because people were using condoms to protect themselves from pregnancy. They were, in essence, also protecting themselves against AIDS transmission by default. Okay, so they weren't necessarily using the condom for AIDS, but they were protecting themselves against AIDS. With the introduction of oral contraception, well, what do you think happened to condom use? Condom use decreased. And as we know, oral contraceptives can help against pregnancy, but they do nothing against the transmission of STDs. So some say that is the primary reason why AIDS rates began to increase, because condom use decreased. We're also dealing with a very different culture in terms of what they are willing to discuss. It is a cultural trait. It is part of culture not to discuss sexual behavior. So even for our team, it was much, much, much more difficult to get information through interviews than it was in Uganda, for instance. So in Uganda, they realized if you want to fix the problem, you need to talk about it. You need to be open about it. In East Asia, particularly in Japan, it is not common for people to talk about personal issues. So it would take several weeks, if not months, to build up a certain amount of trust with people to gather information. So some say there needs to be a change, particularly if the rates continue to increase, to at least be willing to discuss the problem. So again, these are the trends that I want you to be familiar with in Uganda, going from higher rates to lower rates. Women had higher rates. Those that were employed had higher rates, and those that practiced monogamy had higher rates in terms of religion. In East Asia, the rates were low, but now increasing, and increasing in as far as a hypothesis because of the introduction of oral contraception and because of cultural attitudes towards willingness to discuss sexual behavior. So, of course, there's a whole lot to add to this. Again, this is years of research. We explore this in more detail in my medical geography class, but this does give you a little bit of introduction of how culture can affect the transmission of the disease. So we're talking about the same disease here, okay, AIDS, but it occurs very differently in those two areas, and it diffuses very differently in those two areas based on cultural traits of that specific area. So this concludes our section on medical geography.